pandemic, but it's the people's decision to turn away from the conservative policies implemented by their current president that could set Ecuador up for increased tensions with the U.S. So joining me now to discuss is Professor Danny Shaw, Senior Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Now, Professor, even with the runoff election, the people of Ecuador have made it clear that they want back the leftist policies they thought they were going to get from Lenin Moreno. So what kind of a message is this election sending to the world and more specifically to the U.S.?
Good evening, Rachel. That's exactly correct. This is a major victory for the left-wing anti-imperialist forces led now by Andrés Arauz, a mentee of Rafael Correa. The Arauz victory, while the UNES, La Unión por la Esperanza, is celebrating right now, they have another big showdown in 45 days. So it's a cautious celebration, and it's more getting into organizing mode to go into specifically the indigenous areas, because right now the indigenous vote is very split. And as we speak, Arauz has 32% of the vote, but then Lasso, the neoliberal right-wing candidate, and then Carlos Perez, the quote-unquote indigenous candidate, they have 19% each. So it's still not clear who will be in the runoff against Andrés Arauz.
Yeah, and I know this is the country where we've talked about massive protest over the last couple of years. And so certainly the people are coming out, they're speaking out, and they're voicing who they want to win the next election. Now, we also know that the coronavirus pandemic has hit Ecuador incredibly hard. And it's interesting that it's the candidate with the most support so far has been leftist economist Andrés Arauz, who is promising $1,000 checks as soon as he takes office. How big of a role do you think the people's basic need to survive has played in this election specifically?
We saw on full display before the world the horrific images of what coronavirus did to Ecuador, like the other neoliberal-led countries, like Brazil, the horrific effects that it had, the bodies strewn through the streets of Guayaquil. So certainly Andrés Arauz, these social policies that will benefit masses and masses of people in this nation of 17 million are extremely important. And in the long term, Andrés Arauz, and they represent part of the Bolivarian camp. They represent more unity, more Latin American integration. They represent genuine political, educational, and economic self-determination. Let's remember that what made Rafael Correa so popular was that he stood up to the United States. He stood up to imperialism. He stood up to the U.S. base in Manta and kicked them out. But under Lenin Moreno, the U.S. military has tried to return through the Galapagos Islands. So I think there are some social welfare policies that are at the heart of where Andrés Arauz is at, as well as important anti-imperialist policies.
Yeah, now we can't talk about this country without mentioning that massive IMF loan. We know Moreno's government renegotiated the terms of the $17.4 billion in sovereign debt with bondholders just last year. But now it seems like the top three candidates in this election have all been critical of the conditions set by the IMF. They're all saying that they want changes to be made. Does it look like anything will actually change with the new leader in office?
Well, the neoliberal Lasso, if he were to win, I don't think he will, but he would definitely, he's worked with the IMF his entire political tenure. He comes from a banking background. But Andrés Arauz has said very clearly that the IMF is not the way forward. Let's not forget that a big part of this election, too, is which way forward for Ecuador. Continuing dependence on the U.S., or are they going to open up to the multipolar world, which would mean more investment from the Bolivarian camp, of course, China, Russia, and that multipolar world. So that's what we really have. It's a polar world. So that's what we really have. It's a showdown in Ecuador between forces of self-determination and forces of ongoing neoliberalism. Right before Trump left office, in an 11th hour decision, they signed another $3.5 billion IMF loan with Lenin Moreno. Lenin Moreno has spent the last week here in Washington, D.C. as the people of his country. Some 12 million people went to the polls. How symbolic that Lenin Moreno spent the entire week here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And now, speaking of the U.S. specifically, we haven't heard much at all from Washington in response to Ecuador's latest election results. Does it seem like the U.S. is sort of waiting to see exactly how the results play out before they decide where they land and what they're going to say about it?
I think that's correct, Rachel. At this point, it's still impossible to call it for Lasso or Carlos Perez. There's an important article out in Gray Zone which reveals who the true backers, the NGOs and all of these foreign funding streams that are connected to Carlos Perez, who changed his name to an indigenous name 4 years ago. The U.S. ruling class can spin on a dime. If they have to work through Lasso, they'll do that. If they have to work through these faux progressive politics, through Carlos Perez, they'll do that. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shapes up, not just in the next few days, but in the next 45 days, when again there'll be a showdown between self-determination and neoliberalism in the path for Ecuador and all of Latin America in April.
And the entire world will definitely be watching to see exactly what that outcome is. Great insight as always, Professor Danny Shaw. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rachel.
The president